I'm Elena Carter. I'm 29. A restaurant consultant who built her career one grueling shift, one long night, and one quiet victory at a time. Tonight was supposed to be simple, just dinner with my in-laws at Leclerc, the most exclusive restaurant in Boston. A celebration of 30 years of marriage for Charles and Vivian Whitmore. But what I walked into wasn't celebration. It was a setup. If you've ever been treated like an outsider in a place you helped build, or if you've had to hold your head high while someone tried to humiliate you, tell me where you're watching from. And don't forget to subscribe, like, and share this channel for more stories about reclaiming your voice when they try to silence it. I should have sensed something was off the moment I stepped out of the Uber. The night air was still, too quiet, like the pause before a storm. I smoothed down my black dress, a professional favorite I'd splurged on for industry events, adjusted my coat, and reminded myself, just one dinner. I could handle Vivian Whitmore for one night. But as the elevator opened and I stepped into the hushed elegance of Leclerc, my breath caught. Their table, long, glowing, positioned near the window with the most breathtaking view of the harbor, was full. Every chair occupied. My heart thudded. No one had mentioned that the seating would be tight. Charles rose when he saw me, warmth in his eyes, but then Vivian turned, eyes glittering with practiced concern. "Oh, Elena," she said, as if surprised. "I didn't realize you were still coming. When Daniel told us he couldn't make it, I assumed, well." She tilted her head, as if studying a stain on her tablecloth. "This is a family celebration, after all." The word family lingered in the air like perfume, sickly sweet and meant to choke. I smiled tightly, clenching my hands behind my back. Daniel wanted me to come in his place. He was disappointed to miss it. Vivian's smile didn't reach her eyes. "Oh, I'm sure. But the Delacroix just returned from Marseille and, well, we had to catch up. You understand." She gestured toward the couple seated exactly where I should have been. "Perhaps something more in your comfort zone would be better tonight? A quiet bistro," she added. "Something accessible." I felt the burn rise in my cheeks. The familiar sting of being reminded I don't belong. But this time, I remembered exactly who I was. And she had no idea what I was about to do next. I didn't walk away that night, not yet. But as I stood there, burning under the chandelier's soft glow, trying to steady my breath while Vivian dismissed me with another one of her practiced smiles, my mind slipped back to where all of this really began. It wasn't at this table. It wasn't at Leclerc. It was in a classroom, years ago, in the second floor of East Hall at Boston State University. That's where I met Daniel Whitmore. We were 20, thrown together for a semester-long business case competition. I was on partial scholarship, balancing 3 jobs just to stay enrolled. He showed up on day one in a navy blazer and polished shoes, keys to a brand new Audi clipped casually to his backpack. I judged him immediately, figured he was just another privileged kid checking boxes before taking over daddy's firm. But he surprised me. When one of our classmates fell behind after her mom was hospitalized, Daniel offered to tutor her 3 nights a week. He volunteered at the student pantry, showed up early to meetings, always carried an extra charger for anyone who forgot theirs. And he never once made me feel small when I asked to reschedule our sessions around my graveyard hostess shift. Somehow, between late-night spreadsheets and burnt coffee, we became something. Not instantly, not dramatically, but slowly, steadily. His world fascinated me, clean, comfortable, curated. Mine was all grit and corner-cutting and learning to stretch $20 across 3 days. But he never made me feel like I had to hide that. We'd sit under the exposed brick archway outside the library and talk about our futures. I told him I wanted to help struggling restaurants find their spark again, places like my Aunt Nora's Diner, the one we lost to a soulless fast food chain just before I turned 16. He wanted to do something meaningful with his family's resource, invest in small businesses, build something lasting. "You don't need to prove anything to anyone," he told me once, after I failed an exam because I'd pulled a double shift the night before. "You're already the most determined person I've ever met." I didn't believe him then. Not fully. The first time he mentioned introducing me to his parents, I pretended not to care. But I did. Of course I did. "They'll love you," he said, squeezing my hand. How could they not? I remember standing in front of the Whitmore estate that first evening, white columns, black shutters, the kind of lawn that probably had its own landscaping team. I wore the nicest dress I owned, a hand-me-down I'd altered myself. My hands were trembling when the butler opened the door. And when I met Vivian Whitmore for the first time, she greeted me with a smile so sharp it almost cut. "Carter," she repeated, slowly, as if tasting it. "That's an interesting last name. What does your father do, dear?" I answered with pride. "He runs an auto shop in Rochester. Built it from the ground up after starting as a mechanic." Her eyes narrowed, not much, but enough. That was all it took. And I should have known then. This was never going to be simple. I told myself I was imagining it. That the flicker in Vivian Whitmore's expression, the way her lips tightened ever so slightly when I spoke about my dad's garage, was just a reflex. Maybe she was caught off guard. Maybe I was reading too much into it. But then came the questions. They started innocently enough where I was from, what I was studying. But each one had a pointed edge. "So, Elena," she asked as the first course was served on bone china, "where did your family vacation growing up?" I smiled politely. "We didn't, really. Summers were busy, my dad worked overtime, and I helped out at my aunt's diner." She murmured, tilting her head. "How industrious." Charles, to his credit, seemed genuinely interested in my work ethic. He asked about my classes, even offered thoughtful insight on a business case I mentioned. But Vivian? She sipped her wine like it was laced with judgment, her eyes scanning me as if she were still trying to categorize me. She asked what clubs I belonged to. "I was on the debate team," I replied, "and worked part-time at the campus cafe and tutoring center." "No sororities? Charitable boards?" she asked, feigning surprise. I shook my head. Didn't have time for much else. Daniel didn't notice. Or if he did, he misread it entirely. He laughed and said, "Mom, Elena's too busy actually doing things to worry about social fluff." He meant it as a compliment. He didn't realize it only sharpened the divide. By dessert, I felt like I was being examined under a microscope. My voice grew tighter, my shoulders more rigid. The warmth I had hoped to feel, the welcome I thought Daniel had promised, was nowhere to be found. But I didn't say anything that night. I thanked them for dinner. I smiled through the awkwardness. I kissed Daniel goodnight in the foyer and told him it had been lovely. It hadn't been, but I was too proud to let it show. Over the weeks that followed, I tried. I really did. Vivian would forget to include me in family group texts. When I'd show up at events Daniel invited me to, she'd raise an eyebrow and say, "Oh, I didn't realize you were joining us." Once, after I spent nearly an hour choosing an outfit for Charles' birthday brunch, she greeted me with, "How refreshing that you're not concerned with appearances." And still I kept showing up. Because Daniel was worth it. Because I loved him. Because I told myself that maybe, just maybe, if I tried hard enough, she'd see me for who I really was. But what I didn't understand back then was that Vivian had already made up her mind. To her, I was a reminder of everything she had left behind and everything she feared her son was running toward. Looking back, I don't know why I kept hoping she'd change. Maybe because Charles was kind to me. Because Camille, Daniel's younger sister, seemed warm enough in small doses. Because Daniel always said, "She's hard on everyone at first." But it wasn't true. She wasn't hard on everyone. Just me. Over the next 2 years, Vivian's tactics shifted from subtle to strategic. If Daniel mentioned I had a big client meeting, she'd suddenly call with a family emergency. She insisted I attend. If we were both invited to something, she'd conveniently lose my invitation or forget to include my name on the reservation. At Thanksgiving, she seated me at the far end of the table next to the dishwasher door, then made a toast about the importance of marrying within shared values. At Camille's bridal shower, she gifted a set of heirloom pearls to her daughter with a speech that included the words, "For the women who understand what it means to be a Whitmore." I had helped plan that shower. Paid for the cake. Still, I stood there, smiling, nodding, clapping, my heart tightening in ways I never let show. Daniel, bless him, tried to explain it away. "She's just stuck in her ways. You're reading into it. She doesn't mean it like that." I started to wonder if maybe I was the problem. Maybe I was too sensitive. Maybe I needed to try harder, be quieter, blend in better. I bought the dresses she wore, studied the brands she mentioned, learned to sip wine the way she did, like judgment came with the aroma. But no matter what I did, it was never enough. And yet, I never stopped pushing forward. While Vivian tried to mold Daniel back into the son she thought she was losing, I was building something of my own. I landed a junior position at a restaurant consulting firm. The pay was modest, but I knew the industry like muscle memory. I knew how kitchens ticked and how bad lighting could ruin a great menu. Most of my colleagues had Ivy League degrees and resumes stamped with family connections. I had grit, hustle, and an instinct born from childhood watching my Aunt Nora run a breakfast counter with heart and $11 pancakes that could save a bad morning. By 27, I was managing full client portfolios. I flew across the country to help restaurants find their identity again. I learned how to speak in boardrooms and back alleys with chefs and CEOs. I didn't just belong in this world. I had built a place in it, one late night and lonely flight at a time. But no matter how far I traveled, or how many wins I collected, returning to the Whitmore house still felt like stepping onto a stage I didn't audition for. Vivian always found a way to remind me that I'd never be more than a guest. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that something was shifting inside me. And it wouldn't stay quiet much longer. The shift didn't happen all at once. It began in small ways. I stopped trying to outdress Vivian at family events and instead wore what made me feel like myself. How I corrected people when they mispronounced my last name. How I stopped downplaying my career wins just to keep things comfortable at the Whitmore table. Daniel noticed. "You've been different lately," he said one night over takeout, our living room lit only by the glow of a Yankees game he wasn't really watching. "Different good or different scary?" He smiled, pulling me into his side. "Different powerful." I clung to that word powerful because I'd spent so long shrinking myself to make others feel big. Especially her. Still, the pressure hadn't let up. If anything, it grew worse the more I succeeded. Vivian hated that I didn't need anything from them, not their money, not their name, not their approval. I was moving up in my firm faster than anyone expected. Clients were requesting me by name. Industry blogs had started publishing excerpts of my turnaround strategies. And while she floated through luncheons and charity galas, I was in Denver, Dallas, Miami, boots on the ground, helping real restaurants stay alive in a brutal market. Daniel and I got married the spring we turned 26. It was a modest ceremony in Beacon Hill, brick walls, string lights, homemade vows. We kept it intimate, personal. Vivian had wanted something grand at the country club, complete with engraved menus and a harpist. When we told her no, she didn't speak to us for 3 weeks. But she showed up anyway, in a white dress, with a barely concealed frown during the entire reception. That day should have been about love and celebration. Instead, I spent half of it worrying how my father's speech would be received by a room full of people with stock portfolios thicker than their empathy. But Daniel? He beamed the whole time. He held my hand so tightly during our vows I thought I might bruise. He didn't see the quiet snubs and side glances. Or maybe he did and didn't know what to do with them. "Mom's just being mom," he said that night, brushing hair from my cheek. That had become his refrain. But to me, it felt like surrender. A few months after the wedding, we bought our first home. Not a sprawling estate like the Whitmore house, but a sweet, sunlit craftsman just outside the city. It had a tiny backyard and creaky floors and a kitchen I swore I'd renovate someday. We paid for it ourselves, no family help, no trust fund loans. I remember standing in the empty living room, shoes off, box cutter in hand, and thinking, this is ours. We were building something, slowly but surely. A life that didn't rely on appearances or approval. A life rooted in choice. But no matter how grounded we became, every visit back to the Whitmore estate felt like entering a curated museum where nothing was real, and I was always the exhibit under scrutiny. And even though Daniel was by my side, I was still the one walking into those rooms alone. For a while, I told myself it was enough that love could make up for everything else. But then came the call from Charles. It was a Wednesday evening. I had just gotten off a Zoom meeting with a client in Seattle when my phone buzzed. His name lit up the screen. That wasn't common. Charles was polite, formal, but never casual with communication. Elena, he said, his voice warm. Vivian and I are celebrating our 30th next month. I managed to get a table at Leclerc. I blinked, surprised. Leclerc wasn't just any restaurant. It was the restaurant perched on the top floor of the Tremont building, with 6 months of waitlist and enough elegance to make even the most seasoned diners sit up straighter. And the funny part? I had consulted for them recently. Quietly. Behind the scenes. We'd love for you and Daniel to join us. Charles continued. I softened. Of course. Thank you for including me. He chuckled. Your family wouldn't be the same without you. That phrase stayed with me. Your family. Because when it came from Charles, it actually felt like he meant it. What he didn't know and what I hadn't shared with anyone in the Whitmore circle was that I'd spent 3 months helping Leclerc through a major transition. The restaurant had recently changed ownership and was losing its edge. Antoine Duval, the new executive chef, had been referred to my firm in desperation. I worked closely with him and his team, helping them streamline their service model, update their wine list, and craft a new story around the menu that reflected Antoine's roots and vision. But I'd never brought it up to Vivian or Charles. Not because it was a secret, it just never felt relevant. And if I'm honest, a small part of me didn't want to give Vivian another thing to twist. She'd already painted me as ambitious like it was a flaw. So I kept quiet. When I told Daniel about the dinner, he smiled. That's great. I know Dad went all out getting that reservation. But a week before the event, everything shifted. Daniel got a colurgent. His firm's biggest portfolio client had run into a potential crisis. He needed to fly to Chicago immediately. I'll only be gone 3 days, he said, throwing shirts into a carry-on. You should still go. I hesitated. Without you? They're expecting us. You know how Mom gets if people cancel last minute. That much was true. Vivian treated schedule changes like personal attacks. He paused, lowering his voice. Maybe it's a chance for you two to connect a little. I laughed bitterly. You think that's still possible? He pulled me into his arms. I know it's not fair, but maybe she just needs time. I didn't say what I was thinking, that 6 years felt like more than enough time. But I nodded. As I watched him disappear through the TSA line at Logan Airport the next morning, I already knew something was off about this dinner. I just didn't know how far she'd go to prove her point. The night of the dinner arrived faster than I expected. I spent over an hour getting ready, not because I needed to impress anyone, but because I wanted to feel grounded. Controlled. I chose a sleek black dress tailored, timeless. The kind I usually reserved for pitch meetings or fundraisers. My hair swept up, makeup subtle but polished. I wasn't dressing for approval, I was dressing for armor. By the time I pulled up to the Tremont building, the sky had shifted to soft indigo, and the city skyline shimmered in the glass behind me. I stepped out of the Uber and took a steadying breath. Just one evening, I told myself. You've survived far worse. Leclerc's private elevator opened directly into the restaurant, where the soft lighting, curved walnut host stand, and clinking of fine crystal wrapped around me like a carefully composed sonata. The air smelled of lavender and grilled citrus. Good evening, madam, the host greeted, his accent faintly French. Do you have a reservation? Yes, I replied, steady. I'm with the Whitmore party. For Charles and Vivian's anniversary. Recognition flickered across his face. Ah, yes, right this way. We weaved through the restaurant, past tables filled with laughter and quiet toasts. The design was meant to be intimate but grand, every detail intentional from the hand-blown sconces to the champagne glasses that caught the light just right. Then I saw the Whitmore table. Camille, Bradley, George and Lorraine, the Delacroix, and, of course, Vivian and Charles. They were seated near the windows, with the skyline as their backdrop, Boston glittering behind them like a crown. Charles noticed me first and stood with a genuine smile. Elena, so glad you could make it. But as I reached the table, something was wrong. There were 10 seats. 10 people, no empty chair. Vivian turned slowly, her expression carved in marble. Oh, Elena. What a surprise. My pulse began to thrum. Charles invited us weeks ago. I said carefully. Daniel had to fly out for work, but he insisted I still come. Vivian's hand fluttered to her pearl necklace. Yes, well. When Daniel told us he couldn't make it, I naturally assumed you wouldn't either. I mean, this is a family celebration. The word hit harder this time. Sharper, deliberate. She gestured toward the Delacroix, who glanced at me with polite confusion. We hadn't seen them in ages. Just back from Marseille. So much to catch up on. I gave them Daniel's spot, of course. The silence around the table thickened. Camille looked down at her plate. Bradley reached for his wine. Even the waitstaff seemed to pause. I'm sure we can squeeze in a chair, Charles offered, starting to look around. But Vivian's voice cut cleanly through his gesture. Oh, that won't work. You know how strict Leclerc is about spacing and fire codes. Then, the final blow delivered with syrupy sweetness. There's a charming little bistro just down the street. I hear it's quite accessible. Loaders, My ears rang. My skin flushed with heat. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was theater, orchestrated and rehearsed. And I was the audience. The punchline. Still, I stood there. Not frozen but calculating. Because what Vivian didn't know was that she'd just staged her performance on the very ground I had helped build. And I wasn't going to exit quietly. For a moment, I considered turning around. Walking out. It would have been so easy just a few steps back to the elevator, a quick text to Daniel, maybe even a quiet cry in the backseat of another Uber. I imagined the satisfaction on Vivian's face if I did. The triumphant sip of her wine as I disappeared from her carefully curated scene. But then something shifted. A memory sharp, clear, and oddly empowering rose like a tide. 6 months ago, I had spent nearly every evening in this very restaurant. Not as a guest, but as a strategist. A fixer. Antoine Duval had taken over Leclerc after the previous owners retired. The place was beautiful but crumbling under the weight of reputation and outdated habits. Bookings were down. The menu was too safe. Staff turnover was high. Antoine was brilliant in the kitchen but lost in the front of house. I trained in Lyon. He told me during our first meeting, frustration in his voice. My technique is flawless. Why aren't people coming? I had smiled gently. Because flawless isn't always memorable. Over 3 weeks, I observed everything: how guests felt rushed, how the music clashed with the ambiance, how servers recited dishes without passion. We rebuilt it all, piece by piece. The lighting, the flow of service, the storytelling behind every plate. I brought in local farmers and craft wine pairings, coached the staff to connect, not just serve. Within 2 months, reservations tripled. Within 4, they had a waiting list through spring. And now here I was being told I didn't belong at the very table in the very space I had helped resurrect. The irony was so thick it was almost laughable. I straightened my shoulders. My voice, when it came, was calm and even. I see, I said to Vivian, meeting her eyes for the first time since she dismissed me. Charles opened his mouth again, probably about to protest, but she cut him off with a practiced smile. It's really not a big deal. Elena understands. These things happen. I didn't reply. Because I wasn't going to argue. I wasn't going to beg for space. Instead, I turned from the table, heels clicking softly against the marble floor, and walked straight to the host stand. Julien the maitre d' looked up and blinked. Then recognition flickered. "Miss Carter?" he said, surprised but genuinely pleased. "What a pleasure. Are you here to meet with Chef Antoine?" I returned his smile with a quiet nod. "Actually, I'm here for the Whitmore anniversary dinner. But there's been a mix-up with the seating. Is Antoine available by chance?" Julien's brow furrowed slightly, but his professionalism never wavered. "Of course, I'll get him immediately." As he disappeared through the kitchen doors, I turned just enough to glimpse the Whitmore table again. Vivian was watching me. Not curious. Wary. She thought I was going to leave in defeat. What she didn't realize was that she'd just handed me the perfect stage. And, for once, I had no intention of dimming my light. It didn't take long. Less than a minute after Julien disappeared into the kitchen, the doors swung open and there he was. Chef Antoine Duval. Towering in his crisp white coat, sleeves rolled to the elbows, the name stitched in gold thread across his chest. Salt and pepper curls tucked beneath his cap. His presence always commanded attention, but tonight, he was moving with purpose. "Elena!" he exclaimed, arms opening as he crossed the floor with a warmth that filled the room. "Why didn't you tell me you were coming in tonight?" He enveloped me in a hug, unconcerned about who was watching. "I would have had something special prepared," he added, stepping back with a grin. I glanced toward the Whitmore table. Silence. Vivian was frozen mid-sip, her wine glass suspended. The others had all stopped eating, their gazes flicking between Antoine and me like we'd just flipped the script of a well-rehearsed play. I smiled. It was meant to be a surprise. I'm actually here for a family dinner, but there was a seating issue. Antoine's eyes followed my subtle glance, landing on the table I was so clearly excluded from. It didn't take much. He was a man who read a room faster than most read menus. "A mix-up at my restaurant?" His voice grew sharper. "That won't do." He turned to Julien without missing a beat. "Prepare table 12, now." Julien blinked. "The chef's table?" Antoine nodded. "She saved this restaurant. She eats at the best table." I felt my breath catch. "Antoine, that's not necessary." But he was already waving away my protest. "Non, I insist. Nothing but the best for the woman who brought this place back to life." He turned back to me, softer now. "You deserve to be seen, Elena." As we made our way across the dining room, all eyes followed us. I felt the stares, the whispers. I also felt something else. A quiet unraveling. Vivian's perfect evening, her curated social order splintering, unraveling thread by thread. We reached table 12, a beautifully intimate table tucked near the open kitchen with panoramic views of the city and just enough distance from the rest of the room to feel elevated. Julien appeared as if conjured, spreading a linen cloth, laying out polished silver, placing a single white orchid in a narrow vase. Antoine pulled out the chair himself. "Sit, let us honor you tonight." I eased into the seat, heart pounding. Not from nerves, but something deeper. Recognition. After years of swallowing slights, of smiling through exclusion, of trying to belong in someone else's world, I had landed exactly where I was meant to be. Vivian had tried to humiliate me. Instead, she handed me the spotlight. And this time, I wasn't stepping aside. As soon as I settled into the chair, the air around me changed. It wasn't just the view, though. The glittering Boston skyline was undeniably breathtaking. It was the positioning. From here, I could see both the heart of the kitchen and, not coincidentally, the Whitmore table. They could see me too. Julien returned with a bottle of wine, deep Burgundy, aged, unmistakably rare. "The Chateau Margaux 2010, he said, presenting it with a slight bow. "Chef Antoine mentioned it was your recommendation to include on our pairing list." I blinked, surprised. Yes, it was. But he smiled gently. Compliments of the kitchen, Miss Carter. The cork popped, the wine breathed, and I watched as he poured the first glass with care. His presence, his precision, it was reverence. And I felt it, deep in my bones. Just as I lifted the glass to my lips, I noticed movement from the Whitmore table. Charles had risen. He crossed the dining room with a puzzled expression, casting glances at the kitchen, the staff, the elegant table I now occupied. When he reached me, he leaned in, voice low and cautious. "Elena," he said, "how do you know the chef?" I met his eyes. "I consulted for Leclerc 6 months ago. When Antoine took over, the restaurant was in trouble. I helped redesign the experience, the menu, even the partnerships with local farms." Charles blinked slowly. "You did all that?" I nodded. Quietly. I didn't mention it before. I wasn't trying to make a statement. He looked back at their table, where Vivian now sat stiffly, her hands white-knuckling the base of her wine glass. Camille and Bradley were whispering. George and Lorraine both stared in open curiosity. "She told us it took every favor she had to get this reservation." Charles muttered, more to himself than to me. Julian appeared at my side again. "Is everything all right, Mr. Whitmore?" Charles cleared his throat. "Yes, I was just learning something new about my daughter-in-law." Julian smiled. "Miss Carter is highly respected here. Chef credits her with Leclerc's turnaround." Charles turned back to me with something different in his eyeless formality, more acknowledgement. "Would you like to rejoin our table? I'm sure we can find a way to fit you in." It was tempting for a split second. The olive branch. The easy route. But I didn't come here to be squeezed in. "That's very kind, Charles," I said softly. "But Chef Antoine has already arranged a tasting menu for me. Please, enjoy your dinner. We can catch up another time." He hesitated, then gave a slow nod. "Understood." As he walked back across the dining room, I caught the shift ripple through their table. Vivian's cheeks were flushed. Camille kept glancing toward me, biting the inside of her lip. Even the Delacroix looked increasingly uncomfortable. And then, just as the amuse-bouche arrived, a delicate spoonful of something citrusy and floral not from the menu, but created just for me, Julian set down a small handwritten note. "For the woman who reminded us what story means in every dish, eh?" I smiled. This wasn't just a seat at a table. It was a seat I'd earned on my own terms. And now, everyone in that room knew it. The flavors on that first bite were delicate citrus blossom, chilled pear, a whisper of saffron. But it wasn't the food that made my throat tighten. It was the gesture. The kind of personal acknowledgement that, for years, I'd silently craved from another table across the room. I let the moment settle. I sipped my wine slowly. I breathed in the hum of the kitchen, the faint clinking of glassware, the quiet conversations rising and falling like gentle waves. And then, from the corner of my eye, I noticed Camille approaching. She moved cautiously, arms crossed, eyes flicking toward her mother, who remained statuesque at their table. When she reached mine, she didn't sit. She didn't smile either. She just looked, conflicted. "Mom said you weren't coming," she said, skipping any pleasantries. "She told us Daniel had to fly out last minute, and that you were staying home." I raised an eyebrow but didn't answer right away. I didn't know she had other plans. Camille swallowed. If I had realized what she was pulling. I set my fork down. "Camille, this isn't the first time. Let's not pretend it is." Her gaze dropped to the floor. "I know." It was the first honest thing she'd said. She looked back up, her voice softer now. "Colin thought it was funny at first. The way Mom manages things. But even he's uncomfortable now, it's embarrassing." I didn't gloat. I didn't offer forgiveness either. Not yet. "Would you like to join me?" I asked, surprising myself as much as her. Her eyes widened. "Here? At the chef's table?" "Why not?" I gestured to the empty seat across from me. "Unless you'd rather go back and pretend nothing's wrong." Camille hesitated, and for a second, I thought she might actually take it. But then she shook her head. Better not, Mom's already unraveling. But maybe we could have lunch sometime, just us. I held her gaze. I'd like that. She nodded once, then turned and walked back across the floor. Vivian watched her with a look that was part suspicion, part wounded pride. I recognized it. It was the face of someone who realized they were losing control, one subtle shift at a time. The next course arrived fresh halibut with a fennel pollen crust, served on a slate plate with a smear of black garlic puree. Beautiful. Impeccable. Like everything else that night. But the real flavor wasn't on the plate. It was in the silence from their table. In the sideways glances. In the awkward stabs of silverware. The Andersons Delacroix. I reminded myself like they wanted to melt into their seats. George and Lorraine whispered behind raised hands. Even Bradley, who rarely looked beyond his scotch, seemed uncomfortable. The spotlight Vivian had turned on me had backfired. She had planned a performance where I was the outsider, the uninvited. But now, she was the one being stared at. And I without. Julian returned with the next wine pairing and a delicate card beside it handwritten again. Spring menu preview, your opinion means more than stars. I smiled. Antoine was making a statement, and not just to me. Across the restaurant, a few diners had begun to notice. Heads turned, whispers spread. Someone from the table near the kitchen leaned over to ask a server, "Is that the chef's table? Who is she?" I wasn't trying to be seen. But I wasn't hiding anymore either. Then came dessert. 2 courses were brought out simultaneously to the Whitmore table, one to mine. Their dessert, elegant, refined, standard menu fare. A poached pear tart with a champagne reduction. Mine. A towering creation of dark chocolate ganache, pistachio mousse, candied violets, and a swirl of gold leaf. A sparkling sugar cage draped the top like a crown. The difference wasn't subtle. And that's when she broke. Vivian stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor with a screech that cut through the soft hum of the restaurant. Conversation stalled. A few forks froze mid-air. She stormed toward me, heels clicking sharp and fast. "Excuse me," she hissed, stopping beside my table. Her voice was pitched low but pulsing with fury. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" I looked up, calm. "Enjoying my evening." "Don't be coy with me. You pulled strings. You used Daniel's name." "No," I said, cutting her off. "I used mine." Her jaw clenched. "You planned this, didn't you?" She spat, leaning closer. "You knew I wouldn't include you. You set this up to embarrass me." I set down my dessert fork slowly. "Vivian, I didn't set anything up. I came here for dinner. You made it something else." She faltered, blinking. Behind her, the rest of the family had turned in their seats to watch. The Delacroix were frozen. Camille looked horrified. Charles had risen but didn't intervene. I took a slow breath, just loud enough for only her to hear. And for the record, I didn't need to pull strings. Antoine invited me to this table because I helped him rebuild this restaurant. You chose this place to prove a point. You just didn't know I'd already left my mark on it. Before she could respond, a deep voice joined us. "Is there a problem here?" Antoine had stepped forward, wiping his hands on a clean towel, brow furrowed but composed. "Miss Whitmore, I believe we were just finishing dessert. May I offer you and your guests a digestif in the lounge?" Vivian's eyes darted from him to me, then back again. She had lost control of the room. And for the first time in years, she knew it. Vivian didn't answer right away. She looked at Antoine like she couldn't decide whether to beg for dignity or demand it. Her lips parted, then pressed together again tight, controlled, desperate. She was trying to recalibrate, to resurrect the composed matriarch mask she'd always worn like armor. But it wouldn't fit anymore. "Of course," she said finally, her voice brittle with restraint. "Coffee in the lounge sounds lovely." Antoine nodded once, then glanced toward Julian. Within seconds, a team of servers appeared to begin clearing their table. Vivian turned to go, but before she could walk away, Charles stepped up beside her. He didn't touch her arm, he didn't whisper in her ear. He just looked at me. "Elena," he said quietly. "Thank you for staying tonight." I met his gaze and offered a small nod. He turned back to his wife. "I think you owe her more than coffee." Vivian stiffened. Around us, the air grew still. George and Lorraine stood nearby, awkwardly lingering. Camille and Bradley hung back. The Delacroix had started collecting their things like they couldn't get out fast enough. And yet, no one moved. Vivian looked at her husband as though he'd betrayed her. Then she looked at me. "I may have misjudged," she said slowly, like the words were foreign on her tongue. "If you felt unwelcome tonight, Elena, that wasn't my intention." It wasn't an apology. Not really. But it was more than I'd ever been given before. I held her gaze, steady and unflinching. "Thank you for saying that." Antoine, ever graceful, stepped in again. "Mrs. Whitmore, the lounge is ready when you are. And please do enjoy our signature chocolates." They were inspired by a tasting menu Miss Carter helped us design. I could almost see Vivian's breath hitch. Still, she managed a tight smile, nodded at Antoine, and turned on her heel toward the exit of the dining room. One by one, the others followed. Charles lingered. "I owe you something too," he said, voice quiet. "I've known deep down how Vivian treats you. I've just stayed silent. That ends tonight." I wanted to respond, but my throat felt tight. So I just said, "Thank you." He nodded. I looked around, my plate mostly empty, my wine glass half full, my breath finally steady. Antoine reappeared, this time without pretense. He pulled out the chair across from me and sat, tired but calm. "That was dramatic," he said, smiling just slightly. "You okay?" Surprisingly, I was. "I think so," I said, slowly. "It's been a long time coming." He studied me for a second, then leaned back in his chair. "My mother-in-law hated me for 5 years," he said. "Told my wife I'd never make it as a chef. Said passion didn't pay bills." "What changed?" I asked. He grinned. "I got a Michelin star." I laughed, unexpected and genuine. "So all I need is a dining empire to earn her respect." He raised his glass. Or just the courage to stop chasing it. And in that moment, I knew. Tonight hadn't been about proving anything to Vivian. It had been about freeing myself from needing to. The next morning, the sunlight filtered through our kitchen windows in soft, golden streaks. I sat barefoot at the counter, still in my robe, sipping coffee from the mug Daniel had gotten me on our first anniversary, the one that said, "Fueled by grace and grit." Appropriate, I thought. More than ever. My phone buzzed. I half expected it to be Daniel, checking in from Chicago. But it wasn't. It was Camille. "Camille. Last night was something. Mom's still in shock. Lunch next week? My treat." I stared at the screen for a beat, then smiled. Not long after, a new notification. This time, an email from Charles. Subject: Apology and appreciation. Elena, I wanted to reiterate how sorry I am for last night's unfortunate situation. Vivian and I would appreciate a chance to speak with you and Daniel when he returns. Please let us know when might be convenient. Sincerely, Charles Whitmore. A genuine attempt. Formal, yes, but thoughtful. Charles didn't move quickly, but when he did, it usually meant something. Before I could even finish reading it, another ping. This time from an unknown number. A delivery notice. When I opened the front door, a massive arrangement of white orchids greeted me, along with a card in scripted print. "We deeply regret our unknowing involvement in last night's discomfort. Please accept our sincerest apologies. The Delacroix. The Delacroix." I didn't know whether to laugh or roll my eyes. But I appreciated the gesture. The optics of it all had clearly unsettled them. And honestly, good. By noon, I had received 5 separate messages from people at that table, all of them reaching out. Except, of course, Vivian. She remained silent. Until Daniel called. His voice came through a little shaky, like he already knew something was wrong. "My dad called me this morning," he said. "What the hell happened last night?" I gave him the condensed version. No added drama. Just the facts. He listened without interrupting, but I could hear his breath catch when I told him about the seating, about how Antoine stepped in, how Vivian confronted me in front of the entire dining room. "I can't believe she did that," he finally said. Then paused. "Number. That's not true. I can believe it. I just can't believe I've let it go on for this long." His voice cracked slightly. "I'm so sorry, Elena. I should have said something years ago. I've been excusing her behavior because it was easier than confronting it, but that stops now." I leaned against the wall, pressing the phone to my ear like I wanted it to anchor me. "I'm flying home early," he said. "I'll be there tonight." And when he stepped through the front door hours later, he loosened, suitcase still in hand. He pulled me into him like he couldn't hold me close enough. "No more," he whispered into my hair. "No more letting her treat you like this." And for the first time in our marriage. 2 days later, Charles called again. This time, his voice was different. Strained, but steady. "Vivian would like to speak with you both," he said carefully. "Here, at the house." I hesitated, the weight of the invitation tightening in my chest. I looked over at Daniel, who sat at the dining table flipping through emails but listening closely. "I don't know if I'm ready for another performance," I said honestly, not bothering to hide the fatigue in my voice. Charles was quiet for a moment. Then, "I understand, but I think this is important for all of us." Daniel met my eyes. "We'll go, together." The drive to the Whitmore estate was quiet. Not tense, just thoughtful. The same tree-lined streets, the same pristine hedges, the same towering white columns at the front door. But something felt different this time. Less intimidating. Charles answered the door himself. Another shift. Normally, a housekeeper did. "Thank you for coming," he said, leading us into the formal. Her hair was pinned, her dress impeccable. But her eyes. They looked tired. "Ethan," she began, then caught herself. "Daniel." "Elena." We sat across from her, the silence settling around us like a held breath. Then she spoke. "I want to apologize." It wasn't warm. It wasn't tearful. But it was clear. "My behavior at the restaurant was inappropriate. I should not have excluded you, Elena. And I should never have spoken to you like that in public." Daniel shifted beside me, his jaw tight. "That's it?" he asked. "After years of making her feel like an outsider? That's all you have to say?" Charles gently raised a hand, but Vivian surprisingly didn't flinch. "No," she said. "That's not all." She turned toward her son. "Your father and I had a long conversation after the dinner. He helped me see that my behavior hasn't just been cold. It's been controlling. And rooted in fear." Daniel's expression softened slightly, but mine stayed still. "Fear of what?" he asked. Vivian's hands trembled just a little as she smoothed an invisible wrinkle in her dress. "Of losing you," she said simply. "Of losing the world I built around you." There was something in her voice, fragile, unfamiliar. Vulnerability, maybe. She looked at me then. Not with her usual calculation. Not with disdain. Just human. "You didn't need us," she said quietly. "That scared me. You made Daniel question things I thought were set in stone. You reminded me of someone I worked hard to leave behind." I didn't speak. Not yet. I wanted to hear where this went. "I see now that I pushed you away because I didn't know how to welcome someone who didn't play by the rules I spent my whole life following. That was my failure, not yours." And for the first time since I'd met her, I saw not the queen of the country club but a woman who had built a life out of survival and status and didn't know what to do with someone who'd done the same without hiding it. "I don't expect forgiveness," she added, "but I would like a chance to move forward with mutual respect." Daniel glanced at me, waiting. I drew a slow breath and said the only thing I knew to be true. "I'm willing to try, but it has to be real this time." Vivian nodded once. No argument. No conditions. And in that tiny pause, something finally shifted between us. Change didn't happen overnight. I didn't walk out of the Whitmore estate suddenly healed or even fully hopeful. But something had shifted undeniably. Vivian's words weren't glowing with warmth, but they weren't cold either. They were real, honest. And maybe, for someone who had built her entire life around maintaining appearances, that was the most vulnerable she knew how to be. In the days that followed, small signs began to appear. On Thursday, I received a text from an unknown number. "Vivian, would you recommend LeClaire for a lunch with my board members? Or is there somewhere less formal you'd suggest?" It wasn't flowery. It wasn't accompanied by a forced smile emoji or thinly veiled sarcasm. It was a professional question. Straightforward. Respectful. I stared at the message longer than I needed to before replying. "Me. LeClaire is wonderful, but if they're new clients, I'd suggest Gramercy and Pine. Quiet. Locally sourced menu. Comfortable but elevated." She responded within 5 minutes. "Vivian. Perfect. Thank you, Elena." 2 days later, she forwarded me an article about a restaurant in Portland that had recently undergone a major turnaround. "Reminded me of the kind of work you do," she wrote. The compliment was oddly clunky, but I knew she meant it. I told Daniel about it later that evening, and he smiled softly. "She's trying, in her own way." "She is," I admitted, stirring my tea. "It's strange. I never thought I'd see the day." "She may never be warm," he said, "but if she can be fair, that's enough." And he was right. We didn't need to become best friends. I didn't need her validation anymore. But respect, that was non-negotiable. Camille and I did have that lunch. We met at a quiet cafe tucked behind a bookstore in Beacon Hill. For the first time, our conversation felt natural. Not forced, not scripted. She talked about growing up under Vivian's expectation show. Everything had to look perfect, feel effortless, reflect well on the family. It was exhausting, she admitted, stirring her iced tea. "You know what the craziest part is?" "What?" "Mom comes from nothing." I blinked. "What do you mean?" "Her father was a janitor. She worked as a waitress to put herself through community college. She met Dad when she was serving tables near his law school." I nearly choked on my sip of water. "Vivian was a waitress?" Camille nodded. "She reinvented everything. Changed her name, studied etiquette books, distanced herself from her old neighborhood. She's been curating her life ever since." Suddenly, it all made sense. The comments about appearances. The need to control. The discomfort with my background. Vivian hadn't rejected me because I reminded her of something lesser. She rejected me because I reminded her of herself. A self she'd buried under pearls and pristine dinner parties. As Camille sipped her drink, I stared out the window, letting the revelation settle. It didn't excuse everything. But for the first time, I understood her. And somehow, that made all the difference. 6 months after that unforgettable night at LeClaire, Daniel and I hosted a small gathering at our home. It wasn't a housewarming exactly. Lived here for nearly 2 years, but we had just finished the kitchen renovation. And for the first time, it finally felt like ours. The new space had a wide butcher block island, soft sage cabinets, and a French farmhouse sink I'd dreamed about for years. The layout let me move freely, teach, create. It was designed for shared meals and laughter. For life. That afternoon, People filtered in slowly, neighbors, colleagues, friends from both of our worlds. Rachel from my firm brought her husband and their twin boys. Chef Antoine and his wife, Charlotte, arrived with a few bottles of biodynamic wine from a vineyard he swore would change our lives. My father stood by the grill with Charles, trading tips on maintaining vintage motorcycles and shaking hands like old friends. And Vivian? She came too. She looked slightly out of place at first, perched on a wicker garden chair with a linen wrap around her shoulders. But she was present. Not out of obligation, not as a performance. She engaged in conversation with my Aunt Nora, who had taken over my late aunt's diner and turned it into a thriving farm-to-table brunch spot. I caught snippets of them talking about sourcing seasonal produce, about community, about how hard it was to keep a restaurant alive these days. I stood by the kitchen window, watching them, my hands resting on the edge of the sink. "Elena?" a voice behind me said. It was Sophia, Vivian's niece, a sophomore at NYU, studying hospitality management. She looked hesitant but hopeful. "Can I ask you something about internships?" she asked, holding up her phone, already prepared. I smiled. "Of course. Come on in." We sat at the island, walking through her options. Hotel groups, boutique concepts, restaurant groups. I told her what I wished someone had told me years ago: follow the story, not just the shine. As we talked, I noticed Vivian watching us from the patio. Our eyes met through the glass. And then, she nodded. Small, subtle, but real. She never spoke aloud the truth Camille had told me over lunch. Never confirmed her past as a waitress, her upbringing, the self she'd buried. But that nod, that flicker of recognition was enough. It said, "I see you. And maybe even, you see me too." Later that evening, after the last guest had gone and the string lights twinkled softly above the backyard, Daniel and I cleaned up together, quiet, content. "That went well," he said, wrapping an arm around me as I stacked empty glasses. "Better than expected," I agreed, leaning into him. "Your mom even ate my food without analyzing it under a microscope." He laughed, then grew thoughtful. "I've been thinking about something." I glanced at him. "Oh? What would you think about starting a family?" My breath caught. "Are you serious?" He nodded. "Watching you with Sophia today, I could see it. You'd be an incredible mom." I turned fully toward him, my heart unexpectedly full. "And what kind of in-laws do you think we'd be?" He smiled. "The kind that support without control. That love without conditions." I looked around our home, warm, imperfect, lived in, and imagined a child running barefoot across the floor. Laughter spilling down the hallway. A life shaped not by expectation, but by choice. "I'd like that," I said softly. "I want to break the cycle." And in that moment, I realized something. The night at Leclerc wasn't about winning. It wasn't about proving myself. It was about ending something. A legacy of silence. Of shrinking. Of needing permission to take up space. And now, with Daniel's hand in mine and the past finally behind me, I was free to begin something new. Something honest. Something wholly mine. A few weeks after that gathering, I found myself standing behind a podium I never thought I'd return to. It was the annual Women in Culinary Leadership Summit in New York, a place I once walked through as an attendee, not a speaker. Back then, I took notes feverishly, barely daring to ask questions. Now, I was invited to give the closing keynote. I wore navy, not black. Daniel's quiet encouragement. "Let them see your light," he had said that morning, helping me fasten the tiny gold pin my grandmother once wore on her apron. "Not your armor." I stepped onto the stage, heart thumping but steady, and looked out at a room filled with women of every age, every background: chefs, line cooks, students, business owners, and dreamers. And then I spoke. Not about metrics or milestones. Not about strategy or quarterly reports, but about memory. About the smell of burnt sugar from my aunt's kitchen in rural Vermont, and the way food had always been the one language I understood fluently. About how, for years, I learned to make myself small in rooms where others took credit for my flavor, my ideas, my identity. About a night in Charleston at a long white table set for celebration that finally cracked open something I didn't even know I had buried. And about what happened after. I told them how power doesn't always look like loudness. Sometimes it sounds like the quiet click of your own front door closing behind someone who once made you doubt your worth. And sometimes, power looks like staying, like choosing to love anyway. Like redefining family on your terms. As I closed, I noticed a woman in the front row dabbing her eyes with a folded napkin. A younger girl beside her sat wide-eyed, phone recording every word. When I stepped off stage, they both stood to hug me. No words, just something known. Later that evening, I received a handwritten note from one of the summit organizers. Elena, your words were nourishment. Thank you for feeding more than just the palate today. Lizette. I tucked it into my journal alongside a photo Daniel had snapped that morning, me on the balcony of our hotel, barefoot with a coffee cup in hand, the Manhattan skyline behind me. Unaware the day would become a quiet turning point. That night, back in our hotel room, Daniel reached for my hand and said, "You didn't just speak today. You healed." I looked at him, eyes stinging a little, and whispered, "I think, for the first time, I finally believe I belong in the room." He smiled. "You built the room." And somehow, that meant more. Not because I wanted to be above anyone, but because I finally stopped standing under everyone. It wasn't just about the industry or the family name I once felt crushed beneath. It was about me reclaiming every part of myself, the little girl in Rochester who thought dreams had to be hidden to survive, and the woman in Boston who now stood, fully seen, fully grounded. And this was only the beginning. A few days after I returned from New York, an unexpected envelope arrived at my door. It wasn't from a vendor, or a media outlet, or a thank you card from the summit. It was a formal letterone that made my breath catch the moment I saw the Whitmore family crest stamped in gold. I hesitated before opening it. Daniel stood nearby, silent but watchful, as if he could already sense the weight of what I was holding. Inside was a letter from Evelyn Whitmore herself. It was brief, coldly polite. She was extending an invitation to attend a family dinner at the estate next month. A gathering to honor her husband Gregory's retirement from the family business, though we both knew he had stopped working years ago. But the part that made my hands shake wasn't the invitation. It was the postscript. It would mean a great deal to Gregory if you made an appearance, especially now that your ventures seem to be doing so well. Family should be together for milestones, don't you agree? No apology. No acknowledgement. Just a subtle Tuga reminder that, in their minds, I was still someone they could summon when convenient. For a moment, I felt that old ache rise in my chest. The reflex to perform. To smooth things over. To pretend none of it happened. But then I looked around my kitchen. The ceramic tiles I'd chosen myself. The cookbooks I'd scribbled in. The photo of me and Daniel from our trip to Maine. And the shelf where that Chef of the Year plaque quietly rested, collecting flour, dust, and pride. I wasn't the same woman who once sat quietly at their long dining table, unsure of her place. Still, the letter haunted me for days. I'd reread it late at night, unsure why it stirred something deeper than anger, something closer to grief. Daniel noticed my restlessness. One night, as I stared at the envelope again, he finally said, "You don't have to go, you owe them nothing." I nodded slowly, but my voice caught as I answered, "I know I don't, but I need to decide whether walking in again is weakness or strength." Because this wasn't about them anymore. It was about what I still needed to let go of and what I might need to reclaim. I didn't RSVP. Not officially. But I showed up. A month later, I stood at the base of the Whitmore Estate's grand staircase, the same one I had once timidly descended on holidays, dressed like a stranger in borrowed pearls. But this time, I wore a deep green silk gown of my own choosing, hair swept up, voice steady. Daniel stayed behind. This was my reckoning. Mine alone. The estate looked the same, as if preserved in time, stiff with money, brittle with tradition. Waitstaff in crisp uniforms, chandeliers like frozen fireworks, and the faint scent of lilies and pride in the air. Guests milled about in designer suits and subtle judgment. When I stepped into the main hall, conversations paused for a beat too long. A few eyes widened, a few mouths pursed. And then Evelyn approached. "Thank you for coming, Elena," she said coolly, holding out her hand like she hadn't once humiliated me in front of this very crowd. "Gregory will be pleased." I smiled softly. "I didn't come for Gregory." She blinked. Just once. A flicker of confusion, maybe even fear, passed behind her polished mask. Dinner was served in the long hall, just like always. Gregory gave a speech filled with bland gratitude and backhanded references to legacy. At the end, he looked at me just briefly and said, "We've seen many surprises in this family, but some of them have proven valuable after all." The room clapped. My fingers stayed still against the linen napkin. When dessert was served, Evelyn leaned in toward me and whispered, "You've made quite a name for yourself. Imagine if you had embraced the family's help earlier." I turned toward her slowly and replied, "You taught me how to survive in silence. But I built success through truth. That's something this family never learned to value." She straightened. Her lips pressed into a line. I rose quietly, walked away from the table, away from the chandeliers, away from the performance. And as I stepped into the evening air outside, the cool wind against my skin felt more real than anything that dinner could offer. There were no fireworks, no final dramatic words. Just a woman, finally free, walking toward a car she drove herself, leaving behind a legacy she no longer needed approval from. And I had only one more thing left to do. The next morning, I sat on the back porch of our cottage in Lenox, wrapped in a wool shawl Daniel had placed over my shoulders before he left to make us breakfast. The October breeze carried the scent of pine and old earth. It was quiet, really quiet. And for the first time, I realized I wasn't waiting for anyone's voice to fill the silence. No apologies from Evelyn. No recognition from Gregory. No retroactive affection from a family that had always mistaken power for love. Just my own breath. My own peace. I watched the golden leaves drift down, slow and deliberate, like they had all the time in the world to become something new, and maybe, so did I. Because this entire journey, every rejection, every dinner I was left out of, every time I was told I wasn't enough or too much, none of it broke me. It refined me. For anyone listening right now, especially if you've ever sat at the edge of your family's world wondering if maybe you're the problem, I want to tell you something I wish someone had told me years ago. You're not too much. You're not too sensitive. You're not ungrateful or cold or selfish for asking to be seen. You're just aware. You're awake. You've grown past the roles they handed you, and sometimes that scares people. But you don't have to shrink to make others comfortable. You get to take up space. You get to build your own table. And if they never come around, if they never say, "I'm proud of you," you still get to thrive. Because your worth doesn't come from their invitation. It comes from your own becoming. This was never just about legacy or inheritance or some dinner party in Westchester. It was about breaking the cycle. About becoming the woman I needed when I was a girl, soft but unshakable, kind but no longer silent. And if you're still on your own version of that journey, just know, healing isn't loud. Sometimes, it's as quiet as a leaf landing outside your window. But it's real. And it's yours. Thank you for walking through this with me. And if any part of this story spoke to your heart, if you've ever rebuilt yourself from the wreckage of a family who couldn't see your light, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this with someone who needs to hear it. Your voice, your truth, Your story, it matters. Always has. Always will.